Okay, we are ready to begin. Welcome to the INC Transportation Committee meeting for August 2020. Our first presentation is going to be Reimagine RTD. We have a presentation from Bill Soroy, and I'm looking for your co-presenter. Bill, you can unmute yourself. And Annie, you can drive. Oh, Julie, are you going to present as well?
Yes, hello.
Hello. Okay, so between Bill and Julie, the time is yours. We'll have about half an hour for this topic, including Q&A.
Thanks, Joel. My name is Bill Soroy. I'm the Senior Manager of Transit-Oriented Communities. Those of you who were at last month's meeting, you heard a quick rundown, a little bit about our background on kind of the state of things with RTD in terms of our finances. We're going to get into a little bit of that tonight as well. But just for those of you who weren't at last month's meeting, we're in a tough stretch. Transit has been heavily impacted by the virus. We rely on getting, bunches of people together on our buses and trains, and obviously that's not going to work in today's current COVID world. So we've had ridership cut about, I think our ridership is right around 40%, a little less, maybe a little less than 40% of what it was pre-COVID. We also have been heavily impacted on the financial side. Our budget, we're planning for $166 million budget deficit next year. This year we were lucky enough to get some CARES Act funds from the feds, and we are challenged in terms of meeting those budget limitations for next year. And what we're going to talk about today is Reimagine and how we've kind of done a little bit of a pivot job from where we started a little less than a year ago on this in terms of dealing with some of these more immediate challenges we have. And what we want to talk to you tonight is about, we are going to be making some tough decisions with regarding to service, particularly in our January run board, and then, ongoing as we kind of try to come back from the impacts of this virus. And so we want to talk about priorities, because we are going to have trade-offs, and we are going to have to make some, pick some things that we're going to have to cut. So we're looking for feedback, and we've gone to a number of groups to talk to them about this, and it's really important to get your feedback tonight. So with that, a little intro, I'm going to turn it over to Julie, who's going to go through the presentation, and then we'll have those Mentimeter exercises, but we'll have some open time at the end for questions as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate the opportunity. We appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you guys. Really, I've only got a few slides. Just want to put some context around what we're asking. And then really, we want to spend the rest of our time, as we said, we're going to do a quick Mentimeter exercise. I'm going to hand that over to Annie, but really, we're hoping to do a lot more listening than talking tonight. So with that, Annie, if you want to go to the next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, next slide, but for those of you, I think everybody's familiar with RTD and RTD services, but just as a couple of reminders of how big this organization is. This is a transit organization that serves over 3 million people across 40 cities and towns with a service area over 2,000 square miles. So with that comes opportunities, right? Because you're able to impact a lot of constituents all across the district, but it also raises some challenges, because how do you provide the best service in such a wide, expansive area? So next slide, please. So talking a little bit about Reimagine, the process, we've been spending our time on two major issues, and I know a lot of you guys are somewhat familiar with this. We've had a real technical focus on this. We've had cell phone data, which is really helping us get a sense of really how people are traveling. We've got all the DRCOG land use data and the travel demand modeling. And so we've been doing a lot of technical analysis to get an understanding of how our service is performing now and where the service need is. But at the same time, and a major focus of this effort has been reaching out to groups like yours and talking, like Bill said, when you're in a situation like this, where we're having to look at potentially, or looking at cutting service next year, we need to be laser focused on what our priorities are. And that's what we're going to talk to you a little bit more about tonight. Next slide, please. So there's two pieces. There's a short-term piece, which is the systems optimization plan. That is essentially the service plan, an optimized service plan that best meets the mobility needs of the region, but in a fiscally sustainable manner. And then we really haven't kicked off the second piece, the mobility plan for the future. So that's really taking the long-term look. As you guys know, I mean, there's so many innovations right now in transportation, whether it be technological or private sector, on demand, all sorts of opportunities here. So how does that impact the way RTD provides services, and what is RTD's role in that? We did get a question on the chat I already saw about RTD talking about ending Reimagine the RTD board. You know, I think where we are with that is the board has said we need to be laser focused on 2021. So 2021 is where we're having to really get our focus right now on what should that service plan look like. So we are in the process right now of slowing down the systems optimization plan just a little bit, but at the end of the day, what we've got to focus on right now is that first piece of 2021. Because as we started this, you know, we obviously didn't expect a pandemic to come and have a massive ridership decrease in revenues. So the RTD board, as Bill said, is having to make some of these hard decisions. But the good news is we were already in the middle of this. We were already looking at service. We were already working with the board on priorities and stakeholders and feedback and things like that. So all of that is being fed in as we move forward with Reimagine. So it's essentially a pause to allow the board to really focus on the next thing that they really have to do, which is the 2021. Next slide, please. So key elements, like I said, ongoing determining, you know, we're taking a look at the financial plan. We're taking a look at technically, you know, what can be provided, how it can be provided. And right now we're in the second phase of really talking about priorities and getting a sense from our stakeholders and our board of really, if we have to cut service, what should be our priorities moving forward. All that kind of geared up in January. And then, you know, next year we'll get into the mobility plan for the future a little bit more. Next slide, please. So how do you start with this? So we started with a simple question. When you think of a transit agency, so say, for example, you had a great experience here or a bad experience here, or you've traveled somewhere and you said, wow, that was just an amazing transit agency. Why? Why would you say it's amazing? What is it that you saw? What is it that they were providing that made you think that this is the highest value to you as a potential rider? So next slide, please. That's what we're starting with. So we're going to ask for this feedback. That's what we're going to get into next. But then what are we doing with that feedback? What we're doing is we're taking that feedback and we're developing a series of scenarios. And we've already started with some of this. So these scenarios, the idea is not to pick a scenario. The idea is not to say social equity and community is our #1 priority and everything else can go by the wayside. As you guys know, this is very complicated. RTD has to balance a lot of different needs and a lot of different requirements and a lot of different priorities. So what we're doing is we're putting things into these 4 buckets so then we can compare them. So for example, if we said social equity communities, which what do we mean by that? People that need transit, people that potentially don't own a car or financially aren't in a situation to have a lot of mobility options. So what if we focused a service plan that really just focused on getting those people to their jobs? That would look very different than, say, for example, we took a scenario and said, look at geographic coverage. We've heard a lot of feedback that there are areas around the district that they aren't as dense, so they don't have the same level of ridership. However, they pay into the sales tax too. And so if we developed a service plan that prioritized everybody getting some level of coverage, you can see how that would be very, very different than a service plan that said, let's prioritize those that need transit most. So again, those are just a couple of examples of the reason we're pulling those out is so that we can then compare and contrast the trade-offs. So that's how this feedback that you're going to give us tonight is being folded into this overall process. Next slide, please. So this is where it gets fun. So what we're doing with these individual meetings, next slide, please. We've done some community surveys. We've done an online survey. We've got a technical working group and an advisory committee. So we've been working with a lot of different groups to get feedback, but there are some groups that we want to just make sure we spend some time with. And yours was definitely one of them, because we want to hear from your perspective and from where you sit, what do you really feel? And the people that you work with in your communities, where do you guys feel like the priorities should be for RTD providing service? So the next slide, and I'll be handing it off to Annie after this, is these are 10 categories. So I'm going to walk through these very quickly, and then we're going to ask you to rank these. And I hope what you'll see is, gosh, it's kind of hard to pick your top 3, but what we're looking for is an opportunity for you to rank these, to tell us your priorities, and then we're going to do a separate exercise where we'd love to hear from you about why. If you chose number 2 fast trips, why did you do that? So just very quickly walking through these. And also, if you feel like we're missing something, please put a comment in the chat and we'll capture that as well if you feel like we're missing something that should have been addressed in these criteria. So just walking through them very quickly, what should RTD's priorities be? So for example, if you picked long service hours, you would say one of my top priorities for RTD should be, I work a late shift. I need to make sure that there's a bus available to me when I get out of my job. Fast trips. You know what? I think RTD should prioritize getting me there as fast as possible, even being competitive to travel times with an automobile. Number 3, convenient stop locations. I think RTD's top priority should be making sure we've got the stops in the right locations and they're convenient for riders. Number 4, reliable service. And we've heard a lot about this one. If I am trying to get to my job and I've got to be there at 6, I need that bus to show up at 5:25 like you promised, not 5:26, not 5:30. So really making sure that prioritizing getting the service to be as reliable as possible. Easy transit connections, number 5. So that's, I want to go from downtown to Boulder, and I want to make sure if I have to make a transfer that it's seamless and I can hop right on the next bus and I can be there on time. Number 6 would be frequent service. I think RTD should prioritize, I don't even want to have to look at a schedule. I just want to be able to go outside and know that there's going to be another bus coming within every 5 or 6 minutes. And so that frequent really service, and I think that should be a priority for RTD. Equitable access is one we've talked a lot about with different individuals and different organizations. So this is getting back to the concept I was talking about before, which is I believe that RTD, if this was what I chose, I would be saying that I think RTD should prioritize low-income, elderly, disabled, and other individuals that depend on transit. They should be our number 1 top priority. Number 8 would be geographic access. So that idea of everybody should get some level of service. Obviously it's not going to be as frequent, but everybody, since everybody pays in sales tax, everybody should get a level of service. And then the last 2, high ridership-based services. I think RTD should prioritize where there's riders. So in the densest populated areas, to gather as many people as you can on the buses and trains. And then finally, number 10 would be resource efficiency. So what does that mean? That means I'll put my business hat on. RTD should place every dollar of their resources to get the best bang for the buck that they can for the organization. From efficiency and ridership, they should really kind of focus on what is the business acumen of this industry. So I'll stop there for a second, and then I'm going to hand it off to Annie, and she'll walk you through the Menti poll. But please put a note on a chat if there's anything you have questions about. If you're not sure what we mean by a certain term or where we were trying to get with one of these categories, please go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll keep an eye out for that, and we'll answer it as well. But in the meantime, then I'll hand it over to Annie, and we'd love to have you vote.
Great, thanks, Julie. So after I explain the voting process, I'll put that original slide back up so you can see all your options again with the short explanation. But what we'd love to have you do is grab your smartphone or go into another tab on your browser and enter menti.com. So that's MENTI.com. And when you get to that screen, it's going to ask you for a code. And the code, you do not need to put spaces, but the code is 403213. Yeah, and as some of you have done, if you could just vote for your top 3 priorities. Wow, looks like we're probably going to get around 40 votes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great turnout.
And be thinking about why, because that's what we're asking next.
And in the chat, David Mincer is saying, what are the numbers they have to enter again?
Yes, so let me put that in the chat, but
it's at the top of the page as well, there.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
40, 32, 13.
And that's now in the chat also.
Thank you.
give everybody just another couple of minutes.
Okay.
It's always fun to watch it in real time.
Yeah, it's a super neat tool.
And what you're going to see next is we're going to ask you for why, and you'll be able to see everybody's responses pop up as well. So, and we will make sure, as Bill said, to save a few minutes at the end, because we always have just overall questions, and we certainly want to give you an opportunity to ask those as well.
Let's do a 15-second warning. So if you're debating, get those votes in. Really, some people may not have their phones with them, so.
And if you can't, for some reason, if you're having problems with Mentimeter, just put it in the chat. We will capture anything that goes in the chat. Any thoughts you have, any questions, or if you're having difficulties with Mentimeter, let us know.
Well, Julie, it appears to me that we have some front runners.
Okay, clearly we're looking at frequent service as the highest, reliability or reliable service as second, and high ridership-based services as the third. So that's great.
A very close fourth.
And a very close fourth, you're right, for equitable access. It keeps moving on me, yes, so very, very close. No, this is great. This is exactly the feedback we're looking for. So we'll give you guys just another minute, and then we really want to hear why. Because the ranking is interesting. It's always good to get a sense, but really it's about the why. You know, what is it about reliable service or frequent service that makes you think that should be one of the top priorities? We're very, very interested in your thoughts on that. Oh yeah, close tie between equitable and high ridership-based services.
Yeah. So let's move on. So now you should see an open-ended box where you can tell us more about why you selected those priorities. And as you type, we'll get little bubbles that show us what your thoughts are.
Frequency and easy connections make for fast trips. There you go. For people to choose transit, it needs to be frequent, fast, and all day. Yep, because this is public transit. I like that, public in bold. That's a great point.
So while people's comments are coming in, we can also talk. So I had a few questions in the chat about things that I think are outside of the scope of Reimagine RTD, but I wanted to throw them to you, Julie or Bill. There are a couple questions about fares. And of course, fares has been a big topic when fare adjustments is done. Is Reimagine RTD looking at fares or looking at the effect of fares on people choosing transit, or is that outside of the scope and that's handled another way?
This is Bill. I'll address that. You know, it's fares have been a big issue. Reimagine is not going to be addressing fares specifically. We aren't going to be doing any analysis in terms of elasticity or anything like that. But I will say, and just recently, this past week, the board did have a fairly lengthy discussion about how they want to deal with fares in the context of the pandemic. Our CFO, Heather McKillop, presented the board with some options, including as part of our budgeting process, we do assume a fairly regular fare increase to keep up with inflation. The board was a little uncomfortable with that kind of an approach given where we're at today. So of the options that were presented, they did recommend, in terms of our budgeting process that we are in the middle of right now, that we would suspend the fare increase, which there was a fare increase planned for 2022, for at least a year. And so I think the notion is that, you know, people are very severely impacted by the virus, and they want to see kind of how things evolve. And so they don't want to assume that fare increase is going to be happening in that year. So they wanted to delay it a year. So that's how it's being dealt. I know there's been a lot of discussion about fares and how we're dealing with it. We fully expect that we will have some level, kind of higher level of discussion as part of the Reimagine process, but more than likely, there may be some additional efforts that go on beyond our process next year.
Great. I don't know how long you want to wait for these comments to come in, but there are a lot of really good, interesting ones.
Maybe we take one more question in the meantime, Joel, if you said you had another one.
Yeah, certainly. I'm going to ask Jonathan Potoko to unmute because he had a question pertaining to these options.
Great.
Hey, yes. I just wanted to ask about sort of the option choice we have here. We see evidence from, Stephen Higadishi and all the work that they've done in various cities that resource efficient service, high ridership service, frequent service, and reliable service are really one and the same thing. So it creates sort of a flywheel there. It's all one item. So I'm wondering why we're being asked to choose between these. I'm wondering if we could maybe merge this concept into a single or more limited set of options so that when people choose for this preference, it doesn't appear diluted in the voting. I kind of feel like I'm choosing 3 out of the 4 things that are the same and can't really give an opinion towards the other items.
Right. Well, that is essentially what we are doing. We started with the broadest because we wanted people to have as many options as possible. But exactly to your point, what we are now doing is developing the scenarios, and the scenarios are starting to show us exactly where some of these things tie together. For example, we were surprised with some of our initial analysis that actually focusing on social equity and those equity populations actually helped with geographic coverage. Wouldn't have necessarily thought that that was a combination. And to your point, a lot of these others are tied together. So you're spot on with it. That is the process that we're getting to with these individual scenarios. But we wanted to give everybody sort of the broadest understanding. And some of the groups that we're meeting with, you guys are pretty savvy on this stuff, but we're meeting with groups that don't really understand transit and don't have that background. And so we want to make sure this is as accessible as possible. But your point is well taken and very accurate.
Okay, please continue. We'll do some questions at the end.
Okay. Well, I think we've got, and I won't go through each of these. I'm seeing some great themes. I'm seeing themes around, actually, if you can go back, Annie, I'm seeing some themes around, long service hours. You know what, if I'm a nurse, I'm an essential worker. I'm seeing themes around, the reliability. And that's something we've heard loud and clear from pretty much every group we've met at some level that, we really need to make sure the service is reliable. A lot of focus on equitable access, a lot of focus on frequent and sort of the high frequency. So I think these are fantastic. And what we're going to do is take these back, and we're going to fold them into the ongoing analysis that is going to be used for the board. So what we're sharing with the RTD Board of Directors is the feedback we've gotten, and then the next step will be to start translating these priorities into an actual service plan, the systems optimization plan, so that you can actually see, okay, if these are our priorities, then this is how the routes should lay out and the frequency of those routes. So with that, Amy, I think I've only got 2 more slides, and then we can just open it up for a broader discussion. So public outreach and engagement, again, we started focusing on sort of the what is this and we're trying to accomplish. Right now we're in phase 2. It's really focusing on service priorities and potential scenarios, but we would love the opportunity to come back to you guys once we have the systems optimization plan and say, okay, we heard your priorities. Now take a look at this actual route map and let us know if you feel like we've accomplished the priorities in how we've structured the actual transit plan itself. And then finally, the next slide, contact information. We'd be happy to put this in the chat as well. We would love to hear from you. If you get out of this meeting, you think, oh, I wish I'd mentioned this, we would love to hear that. We are going to be doing more outreach. We'll be doing some virtual town halls. And once we get the draft systems optimization plan, we're going to be doing a lot of outreach. And again, we would love the opportunity to come back and share it with you and gather your thoughts at that time. So with that, we've gotten the pieces we need. Thank you so much. And we'll open it up for any broader questions that you might have.
Okay, great. So Reimagine RTD really has 2 parts. It has the optimizing the system, the map, where the routes run and how frequently they run. And then it has something called the transit plan for the future. I probably have the name slightly wrong. I'm picking questions foremost that speak to that, and I'd like to ask Celeste to unmute. And she had a question about things that fall into that category of system for the future or alternatives.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. How's it going? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. So my question is if you're considering any alternative stopgap services like partnerships with multimodal partners to provide access with the service cuts that are happening, like maybe partnering with the scooter company who could provide additional mobility options to those who are transit dependent, who are now experiencing even greater challenges with the decreases in services. You're seeing that nationwide with some different providers like PBOT up in Portland and SFMTA in San Francisco. And I was wondering if RTD is considering options like that as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
This is Bill. So right, yes, we are. I mean, we are having those conversations. Example is we've been talking with Lyft about supporting some of our in our service areas again where we don't have as much service or feel like we may have to cut more service. We've had discussion from some board members about vouchers specifically for some of those areas. And we've talked with multiple providers. We have a metro taxi pilot that we're just initiating. This is a theme that I think that is going to be very prevalent given our situation that we're going to deal with, of really looking for those partnerships to basically fill the gaps, because we are going to have some gaps. I don't think we can deny that. And so we are going to be doing that and are doing it now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when it comes to Reimagine RTD and the outreach, these are really priorities and value questions you're asking the community. Eleni Saris has a question regarding outreach. Eleni. And I'm hitting.
All right, just took a second to unmute. I just wanted to know how you're doing outreach to limited English speakers, those with disabilities, seniors, those who are unhoused. How do you do that? And then I also kind of had a related question that you've gotten a lot of CARES funding. And how are you prioritizing the use of CARES funding? And does that also have to, did you solicit outreach and input from the community about how to use those funds? And if you've got any grants to that effect.
I'll do the CARES Act funding, and then I think between Julie and myself, I think we can answer the first part of your question. From the CARES Act funding, I mean, we are really using it to maintain the level of service that we have. You look at other agencies around the country, and I think there's been recent information about that. Different agencies are approaching it in different ways. The way the CARES Act funding works, it's basically reimbursable costs that we can bill the feds for to get reimbursed for costs that we incur related to impacts from the coronavirus. So we have been able, as an example, we have social distancing requirements on our vehicles. So we have basically need about 3 vehicles for every 1 vehicle that we had pre-COVID because of the capacity restraints. So we are basically having the same number of vehicles out on the street as a result. And as a result, we are having, all these operators, all this vehicle maintenance, even though we're only at essentially 60% of the service level that we were at pre-COVID. So we are using that CARES Act money to pay for that, as well as to pay for impacts and things like PPE and changes that we're doing to our buses. We're putting plastic protective barriers for our drivers on all of our buses. So those are where the CARES Act funding is going. And like I said, it's helping us kind of basically stay afloat for this year, but next year we've got some big issues from a budget standpoint that we're gonna have to deal with.
So in terms of the first question, the targeted outreach, this is obviously a challenge. Some of the populations you listed are always a challenge to reach, and under the COVID circumstances, they're even more so. So part of what we are doing to reach some of those populations is very similar to what we're doing with you. What we've done is we've identified organizations and individuals that have great ties to these individual communities or populations. So we've been meeting with the Colorado Center for the Blind. We've met with multiple LCCs, which deal with a lot of disabled. We had Tuesday, we had a fascinating meeting with the block captains training group that really was focused in the Montbello area in the African American community. So we've been doing similar meetings like this, and it's been great, the feedback we're getting. So what we're able to do is present to the RTD board, and we'll continue to do so, that here's a broad community survey. that's statistically valid. Here's online feedback we're getting, and then here's the individual feedback we're getting from these populations that are being really impacted by COVID and by the circumstances. So it's not perfect, but it's something that we've had some success with. We feel like we're making some of those connections, and honestly, we are open to any and all suggestions. If you have a group or a community organization or any suggestions, we are absolutely open to that. But that's how we've been focusing in the meantime.
And one of the things I'll add to what Julie said is with our advisory committee in particular, we do have representation on there from the disability community. We have representation from AARP to represent seniors. We have representation from community-based groups who do represent some of those vulnerable populations. So we do have a fairly broad representation on that committee that we did establish up front, understanding that we need to get that diversity of opinion throughout this process.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, we've run out of time for this portion of the agenda. I do want to acknowledge that there were some other questions that came in largely about funding, seeking other funding sources and fairs and so forth, which is kind of outside of the scope here. But please let us know how to reach you all. And actually, let me share my screen because I have contact information for each of tonight's speakers here. So Bill Soroy, his email address is here, William Soroy, and the project RTD, Reimagine RTD, is at this URL, rtd-denver.com/reimagine. Thank you all very much for joining us.
It was our pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. We're going to turn to Pete Van Heuven. She's the Director of Government Relations for Bicycle Colorado, and she's going to give an update that we actually scheduled for the meeting we had right as the pandemic was hitting and things were starting to shut down. And of course, the legislative session changed in character quite a bit. I've made Peep a co-host. You can share your screen when you're ready.
Okay. Let's split up here. I think that works. Can you just see the screen, or are you also seeing some faces on the right there?
The screen is big in the middle, and I think people have their individual choices to how to see talking heads.
Okay, great. All right, hi everybody. I'm Pete Van Heuven. I work at Bicycle Colorado, and I direct the legislative agenda for us and work on Bicycle Colorado's signature efforts to improve access and safety for people who bike. We also are proud to house and support the work of the Denver Streets Partnership. You're going to hear from Jill Locantore a little bit later. She's our executive director for the Denver Streets Partnership. Let me see, there we go. Just a little bit on Bicycle Colorado. Our mission is to lead the movement that champions interests of people who ride or want to ride a bike in our state. And we're envisioning a Colorado where riding a bike is safe and convenient. Biking is a top choice for recreation and everyday trips, and where the benefits of biking are experienced and valued by all people in our state. We're a nonprofit, we're 27 years old, we have about 10,000 members across the state, and that gives us some heft when we get into the legislative session that starts in January. So I'm going to talk a little bit about last year. I'm going to take you back to January of last year, what we worked on, explain some of that, sort of where we are right now in the summer with our slow baking of the cake for the 2021 legislative agenda, and hopefully leave a minute in case there are any questions. Last year, we started in 2020 with a focus on two big bills. One was the bike lane, which is now an act, Bike Lane Act, and also a fourth attempt at a hands-free bill. And we had to play defense on something we were not expecting, which is called the speed limit study. So I'll talk about those three real quick. The bike lane bill, which was Senate Bill 61, was sponsored by Senator Foote and Casey Becker. And it was signed in March, I think on the 30th, and became law on July the 1st. What it does is require motorists to yield the right of way to a bicyclist in a bike lane, which actually had never been codified in state law before. It also creates a traffic offense for failing to yield to a bicyclist or another authorized user in a bike lane. And the failure to yield is going to be a Class A traffic offense. It results in a $70 fine and also 3 points on your driver's license. The piece I like the most about this legislation is that it articulates that a bike lane is expected to pass through an intersection if there's a bike lane on either side of the intersection. So if the bike lane's marked on both sides of the intersection and the driver fails to yield, you can still be ticketed for the offense.
And so this is good news, and we were pretty pleased to get that one in under the wire before COVID. The hands-free bill, again, our fourth attempt with a coalition at a hands-free bill, went a little differently. This one was sponsored by Chris Hansen and Representative Dylan Roberts, and it did pass the Senate 25-9, but it was assigned to House Transportation and Judiciary when the legislature had to take their long break. And at that point, it was withdrawn because they had too much work to get done. They needed to focus on key bills and obviously on the budget. What this would have done is make it a primary offense if you were driving and also talking on your phone at the same time. So it would have added fines and points if you were convicted. And it would have been okay if you were on a phone with a wireless device with Bluetooth or something like that. The push-pull on this bill has always been, for 4 years in a row, that police say they do not have enough in the law to actually enforce distracted driving. And on the other side of the aisle, we have the ACLU and concerned Democrats who have worried about the result, which could be over-policing and profiling of Black and brown drivers. So that has been a tussle for a couple of years, and in fact now is something we're going to be moving away from. And I'll come back and talk about that a little later on. The third area where we worked with a speed limit study, this one, I got to be honest, caught us napping a little bit, and it had passed several committees before we became aware of it. But it was a House bill that requires the Colorado Department of Transportation to conduct a study of rural highways and recommend which highways could have raised speed limits without endangering public safety. So we were really not fans of that. And what we did is we added an amendment to the bill. The co-sponsors of the bill accepted it. It was a friendly amendment, accepted in a friendly way. What the amendment does is it mandates that as part of that study, one of the key factors has to be the safety of vulnerable road users who use the highway. So CDOT will be conducting a study on if there are rural highways that could have raised speed limits, and they will also be reporting out on whether that is in the interest of public safety with respect to vulnerable road users. So that was our 2020 effort. A couple other things, I'm going to go through this real fast, that I would just say we noticed during the 2020 session, as short as it was, is that this actually surprised me. There was some discussion about the gas tax, which you really never hear much about that in a serious way, but there were some rumblings. I thought that was fascinating, and I'm interested to see if it comes back up again next year. There was also an effort with a House Bill 1151 to create authority for regional transportation improvements. Essentially, this would authorize a TPO, a transportation planning organization, to use the powers of a regional transportation authority, an RTA. So they would have the power to impose charges like fees, and also with voter approval, maybe sales or use taxes, and generate their own transportation funding. This is essentially good news for urban areas and really bad news for rural areas that just don't have those entities to pull together and to pass those things. But it was seen as maybe one of the only ways to move forward because statewide efforts have continued to fail. We also saw our transportation chairs, so that's Senator Faith Winter and Representative Matt Gray, begin to explore what I'm going to call a package of use-related fees. And what this essentially is kind of everybody has to share the pain approach of cobbling together a bunch of smaller things into a package that results in at least some monies that can help move transportation forward. So that would have been, for example, some small fees on electric vehicles or the trucking industry or other use fees. And the reason that this is interesting and that we're going to really pay attention is it is, to me, the precursor of a discussion about congestion mitigation and the idea of pricing who is using the roadway most often or impacting it the most. So I think that was a really fascinating discussion to see begin. And then some other things, obviously, there was a CDOT budget focus because all the budgets were getting cut. There was talk about RTD accountability, which ultimately moved out of the legislature and into an effort to create an independent accountability commission. And then, of course, the legislature did pass the Police Accountability Act, which I think is worth noting. Senate Bill 217 requires a legal basis for all police contacts, and it removes qualified immunity and also requires intervention for excessive force. So that is going to, we hope, radically change the way that police and people begin to interact in our state. So now we're going to look ahead a little bit. We have an election coming up in November, and so we pay attention to what the makeup of the House and Senate might look like. And what it looks like to us right now is that the House, obviously, all the representatives are running again. They have 2-year terms. There are probably 4 races that are competitive or toss-ups. With a current makeup right now of 40 Democrats and 25 Republicans, the House will probably stay Democratic. In the Senate, it's a little more interesting. They have 4-year terms. 18 of them are back up for election. There are 5 competitive races, and the makeup right now is 19 Democrats and 16 Republicans. So there could be a shift there. That is a possibility. There's one other thing to watch we're paying attention to. That's the Gallagher Amendment repeal effort, which could free up some dollars. And if those dollars are freed up, you know, it would make it easier to fund K-12 education, and there'd be a little less stress on monies allocated in the general fund to transportation and education and some of those things. And so now we're going to get to our 2021. I'm going to call it my crystal ball, and please bear with me, but it's been a weird year. We could not have imagined where we're going to be at this point in the year, and I think it's a good 3 months still before we really have strong directions in some of these areas, but just wanted to share some of the things that we're thinking about right now. I think it's possible we're going to have a stronger Democratic presence in the legislature. You know, it's likely there'll be a little bit of a blue shift. So that's one thing that we are considering and noting. The second is we know the environment this year will favor cost neutral policy. This is not the year to bring forward any kind of legislation that has a huge fiscal note. Obviously, there will be a shift away from enforcement via direct policing. I think anything that has that at its heart is going to be dead on arrival. And I expect to hear more of some of these themes that started to emerge last year with maybe we should really go back and look at the gas tax, and maybe we should really consider regional authority as a way to let some of our metro areas begin to ask for more revenue and begin to spend more revenue on mobility options, for example. And we should really look at use fees and, you know, the beginnings of what could look like congestion mitigation pricing systems. And then a fifth would be a wild card, and I have no idea where this will go, but there has been talk about a federal infrastructure bill or a green infrastructure bill, and if that does happen on a federal level, it will have certainly ripple effects as we get into the legislative session. So this is my last slide. And I wanted to share just sort of where we are right now in our discussion, which is, I would say, less than halfway through, you know, the work that we need to do to get to a point in December where we really know what we want to bring forward. We will typically be able to drill down to 2 signature efforts that we want to lead on, save space for just knowing that there will be 1 or 2 things we need to play some defense on, and maybe have the opportunity to work on 1 or 2 other things with other partners as part of a coalition. I put some items on the left that we have really been digging into lately. So I'd say we've done a little more work on the items on the left, and on the right, just a few other things that we have that have bubbled up that we've been talking about. So I'll share them with you, but again, with a caveat, you know, nothing on this list is for sure. This process, we're in the middle of a listening phase right now, will not be really cooked until late November. We are talking about distracted driving again. We know that we need to use a different approach than the hands-free approach, and that we can't introduce hands-free as a primary offense again. So I think one of the potential opportunities there is to pair a couple of things together that are what I would call education by legislation. For example, we could look at network level distracted driving, which is something that has come up twice before in the legislature, and that's basically when you have your cell phone, you have the opportunity to tell the cell phone that you want it not to ring or send you texts while you're driving the car. And the phone can tell when you're driving. So you can opt into that. So network level would require the phone provider or service provider to set that for you so that you would have to then opt out of the fact that your phone would turn off essentially when you're driving. So you could override it, but you would have to take a conscious action to actually override it. That paired with, for example, maybe looking at hands-free as a secondary offense, like our seatbelt law. So it is against the law to drive without your seatbelt on. It could be against the law to drive and talk on your phone at the same time, but it could, as a secondary offense, be something you can only be really ticketed for if you're pulled over for something else. So it is not a reason that police could pull you over to begin with. So in that way, you know, perhaps we're looking at things from an educational perspective. It sets a public expectation that you should not drive and be on a phone at the same time. That's one possibility. Automated enforcement is something we're very interested in. And interestingly, you know, this has changed a lot in the last 4 years. It typically has been a bill that comes forward we have to fight against that would ban the opportunity to use any automated enforcement in the state. And there was even a year where it passed both chambers, and I think it was Governor Hickenlooper had to veto it. So every year that effort to ban automated enforcement has gotten a little weaker. And this past year, it died in its first committee. This might be the year to be able to go after automated enforcement and provide some positive reinforcement via legislation. The framework right now is that automated enforcement is only allowed in defined circumstances. So you can use it on residential streets and school construction and park zones, but you can't use it in mixed use areas, which is where transit often is, or commercial zones. And that ties the hands of cities like Denver that really want to use this more as a tool. So perhaps we can get at automated enforcement and start to remove some of those restrictions and create a situation where localities could opt out instead of have to opt in with those restrictions. One other potential.
Out of time here on the on this short topic.
Sure.
If you could just wrap up with the last couple points, and I'll throw a couple questions from the chat your way.
Yeah, totally. Recreational access is really about maybe utility corridor co-uses and rail trail opportunities. E-bike access would help, I think, clear up just some of the confusion as localities are dealing with it differently. And some of the areas on the right-hand side, we're also looking at whether the timing is right for some of these or whether they're a better state effort or Denver effort. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to blend a couple questions from a couple folks. Here's Peep's contact information. When you were talking about some of the new legislation, I got a question from Allison and a question from Loretta saying, how do motorists know about this? Is it going to be added to the driver's test? Are there PSAs to let people know that there's a new regulation regarding entering of a bike lane or hands-free if that were to pass?
Yeah, there are a variety of different ways that municipalities will get the word out about changes to state law. The Colorado Municipal League does a really good job of this. They educate city administrators across the state over the summer so that those administrators can kind of take it home to their communities and plug it into their own public distribution system. So whether that's on their city websites or it's something they need to brief their police on and get it sort of more into the public realm via some of their communications channels. Obviously, we put out information. So if you are following any biking organizations, you're going to hear about the bike lane bill as well. So it's really police departments and it's city or county administrations that that will do the bulk of the educating.
Great. And the last question, I'm going to blend a question from Bruce Biscuit and Allison again. The Denver taking on the safety stop, where why don't you describe what that is and see what do you think the prospects are?
Sure. Very quickly, safety stop is a different way of assigning traffic law to people biking when they hit a stop sign or a red light. So basically it allows the person on a bike to treat a stop sign like a yield sign if there's no other traffic coming, and treat a stop light like a yield sign if there is no traffic coming. In other words, you can roll through if you have the right of way and there's no oncoming traffic. It allows bikes to clear the intersection before traffic arrives. My personal take on this is that it would be much better if we could change this as a state level than to attack it necessarily at the city of Denver level. I think city of Denver doesn't like to be first on big things like this. I imagine that if a variety of municipalities around Denver were to begin to adopt, that Denver would get on board. So is it possible? Yes, but I think actually this might be an easier state fix than city fix. And the key to safety stop is to get your chief law enforcement officer and your chief elected leader at least to neutral, and then to get a majority of the voting body to agree. So in Denver, that is the mayor and chief Payson would have to be neutral, and the majority of city council would have to agree this was a good idea.
Okay, thank you very much. You all now have PEEP's contact information. Just a reminder for our online session, since we went online, we're trying to do a couple short topics like this and a couple longer topics like we had with RTD and like we're going to end with Denver's new street design guidelines. We'll now turn to Jill Locantore to talk about the 20 is Plenty effort. And Jill, you can share your screen at will.
All right.
Looks good.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. I'm Jill Locantore, the Executive Director of the Denver Streets Partnership. And as Pete explained earlier, we are now a division of Bicycle Colorado advocating for walking, biking, transit, and safe streets, specifically here in Denver. And one of our major campaigns this year is 20 is Plenty, where we're asking the city to reduce the default speed limit. If you've seen me present before, I'm sure you've heard me say this and seen this graphic many times, that speed is one of the biggest factors that determines whether a traffic crash happens and how serious that crash is, particularly for people walking and biking. If cars are going 40 miles per hour and hit a pedestrian, it's very likely that that person will be killed or seriously injured. Whereas if the driver's only going 20 miles per hour, that person will likely walk away unharmed. We also know that street design is a major determinant of how fast people actually drive on our city streets, which is why I'm very thrilled about the new Complete Streets Design Guidelines that Riley is going to be talking about later. It's going to allow a lot of new designs not previously used in Denver before, such as speed humps, that are very effective at reducing speeds. But we also know that speed limits also make a difference in how fast people drive. This is from a case study in Seattle where they were very deliberate in simply changing the speed limit from 30 miles per hour to 25 miles per hour. The only thing they did was modify the signage. They did zero communications or any increased enforcement or redesign of the streets. And as you can see from the data here, it not only decreased the number of people speeding, particularly the egregiously high speeds of 40 miles per hour or more, but it also reduced the total number of crashes as well as crashes that result in serious injury. Aside from the safety benefits, we know that slower streets are also more livable streets. When we're talking about Vision Zero, we often focus on the high injury network where the vast majority of the fatalities happen, streets like Colfax and Federal and Colorado Boulevard. But speed makes a big difference on neighborhood streets too. This is where kids should be able to safely play and people gardening in their front yards and walking your dog to the park and just visiting with your neighbors. The slower your street is, the more enjoyable it is to engage in all those activities. So setting the speed limit isn't just about safety, but it's really a statement of how we want our streets to look and feel. And it's a statement that we really value the quality of life on those streets more so than the speed and convenience of driving. And when we identify what that desired speed limit is, then that helps justify the street design changes that really reinforce safe speeds. In Denver, we have a city ordinance that establishes what the default speed limit is in different contexts. The most important one is for streets and highways that I've highlighted here. The default is 25 miles per hour. And this applies to every street where there is no posted speed limit. And it's also kind of the default that the city goes to when they don't have the time or resources to do a full-blown study on that street. They will go to the default. We think that on your typical neighborhood street, which is where this applies for the most part, 20 miles per hour is sufficient. And it would simply take an act of city council to change that one word in the city ordinance. So the primary way we are showing community support for this is through the distribution of free yard signs. You can go to the web address on the slide here and request one. We will deliver it directly to your home. You can choose from one of the two options here, depending on how edgy your particular personality is. And along with the yard sign, we will deliver to you as well pre-stamped, pre-addressed postcards that you can send to your city council representative showing your support for the slower speed limit. So we would love to have you join the campaign as an individual. There are more than 500 people who have requested yard signs so far. This is a map of all the different areas we've delivered to, and you can see it's pretty widespread across the city. And we would also love to have INC's official endorsement as a supporter of the campaign. And that's all I have. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. If you please send questions into the chat to me. I'm listed as Interneighborhood Cooperation. And Jill, I'm going to share my screen. The question Amy Kendrick is asking, how do we officially endorse this effort? So how does one become a signatory to this?
So as an individual, it's just as simple as ordering a yard sign and sending in that postcard to your city council member. It's great if you spread the love to your neighbors as well. But then also if you're part of an RNO, the RNO can sign on as a supporter of 20 is Plenty, and we're hoping that INC as a whole will do so as well.
Great. And everybody here lives in a Denver neighborhood, and you probably have an RNO. You may be a representative from them, or you may go to it, or you may want to go to it. So you might talk to your RNO about if they want to sign on and help add weight to this. Jill and I spoke about this before the meeting, and we have a INC transportation platform. It was adopted by the delegation of INC in 2015. And I think there are 3 points already in there that the INC has already asked for and committed to that I've called out here. It doesn't call specifically for 20, but right at the top, lowering speeds for Vision Zero, revising the lane width standards and speed limits in general, and then down at the bottom here, traffic speeds in residential neighborhoods, which are where the local streets are that Jill's talking about, that have the default speed limits, to be slower neighborhood zones, and then to minimize the encouragement to cut through the neighborhood. You might be less likely to cut through a neighborhood if you have to go slow doing so. So as a member of this committee, as a participant in this meeting, you are a member of this committee and you can vote. I'm going to make this motion, and then if somebody in the chat could second it, and we'll use the raise hands feature for voting on the motion. If you urgently want to discuss the motion, please comment in there and we'll have a little discussion as well. I saw Jonathan Potoko seconded, so we'll do that. And Jonathan, I'll ask you to unmute if you had some urgent discussion on this. No, got a mouthful of food. Great. Okay. So I think everybody can kind of see where I'm going here is that INC has already adopted positions consistent with this. And so we would be recommending that the board of INC simply sign on, and it'll be up to Jill and her organization kind of what that means, a letter or the ability to use INC's name to say they've signed on to this. I'm going to call for people to raise their hands if they're in support of this motion, then we'll lower hands and take a vote of those not in favor of this motion. And if you are at this meeting, you are eligible to vote. This is not like the INC delegation meeting, in which case only, in that situation, only delegates vote. So I'll wait just a moment while these come in. And John Rickey is helping. I want to recognize 2 people tonight. John Rickey is helping to handle the administrative side of Zoom, admitting people from the waiting room, etc. And Jonathan Potoko, who seconded this motion, is keeping notes. Both things that really help. And then if you don't know where the raise hand thing, if you go to the participants list, down at the bottom, raise hand is an option. You may have to go under a little menu depending on what platform you're on. Okay, I'm going to, I see a bunch more hands. People were waiting for me to tell them how to do it. Apologies. And John, are you willing to count?
Yeah, I'll count.
Thank you. John sees 25. All right, I will use a feature that just lowers all the hands that are up, and I will ask people to vote if you're voting against this motion by raising your hand. I'll give this a little bit of time as we did before. There is a question, how are we handling people totally on audio? This is something that's not as easy to do. Let me ask, we have somebody called in from 303-377-66, and I'll not leave the rest of that for the recording. I'm going to ask you to unmute. We also have somebody dialed in from 720-881. I'll ask you to unmute. And you may have to hit #6 or *6 if you wanted to register a vote. But I have enabled either of you to unmute and do that if you wish in the next few seconds. Okay, I see one opposed, and I'm not seeing either the people purely on the phone hitting *6 or #6 to unmute themselves. And again, apologies, the phone is possible. I'm glad it's possible, but it is a less convenient experience. Thank you all, and thank you for your presentation, Jill. Okay, I didn't see any questions for Jill. Jill, did anybody write questions to you directly?
I just had one request to share the presentations so that people could share it with their RNOs and invite them to support the campaign, and I'm happy to do that. You can just send me an email at the address that Joel has on his slide.
Great, and here are those addresses here. So Jill is jill@denverstreetspartnership.org, and with Jonathan Potoko's help, we're going to get the slides out soon with just brief notes, as well as INC has started putting recordings of our meetings on the INC YouTube. So although it was challenging circumstances that got us here, we are, I think, in fact, getting a lot more accessible, except to those who may not be able to attend online. And we're always looking for better ways to do that, as are most groups. Thank you very much, Jill. Our last presentation tonight will be from Riley Lamy. He's a senior city planner with the Department of Transportation Infrastructure, and this is a big deal. This is something INC's been asking for a long time, as have so many of the advocacy groups throughout Denver, is new street design guidelines. So I'll turn it over to Riley, and we do want to reserve some time for questions. Riley, you should be a co-host and could share your screen. There it's going. All right.
All right. Just want to confirm you can hear me and see my screen.
Yep.
All right. Awesome. Let me go all the way back here quick. There we go. All right. Well, thanks everyone and welcome. My name is Riley Lamy, as Joel mentioned, and I'm with Denver's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. I'm a planner that's been involved in the completion of the complete street design guidelines for Denver. And I hope that at the end of tonight, you'll be as excited as I am about the completion of these. I know that this is as Joel mentioned, this is a super big deal for Denver, and we're really excited about what this means. And so I'm going to be sharing some information with you about what you can be excited about and what you can look forward to. So I'm going to hit on 3 important parts tonight, and I'm going to give you both the purpose and the context and provide a little bit of background information about why we're doing street design guidelines. I know I talked to you guys about this, I think it was back in November, but it's been quite a while, so I'm sure you could use a refresher. And then I'll go into the actual structure of the document and talk about what that looks like and what you can expect to find in there. And then the last part will be talking about the highlights. So this is going to cover what the exciting parts are of the document and what the parts of it that are new for Denver or the things that we've never had guidance on before. And I want to start with this picture that I have on the screen that just really shows, you know, all these different parts and pieces of a street. As we all know, that our streets, they belong to everybody, but they also have a lot of different purposes and they serve a lot of different functions. Not only do they move us and they get us to where we need to go, but they also carry water, they carry utilities, they provide recreation opportunities. They are important for our tree canopy. They provide lighting. There's a lot of different purposes. And each one of those different elements that you can see on the screen is something that the Complete Street Design Guidelines has touched, whether that be guidance about the dimensions of street trees or how wide this travel lane is that you see, or what do the conditions need to be for dedicated transit lanes. All of these things that come together to make the streets, that's what is included in this guide. So that's why it's such a big undertaking and why it's really exciting. Now, I will say that, of course, ideally we would have a street that, and have all of our streets have everything that we desire or want on them, whether that's space for restaurants to have cafe seating, adequate and wide sidewalks, space for trees, space for vegetation, a protected bike lane, space for parking, space to drive, space for transit, all of these things together. But what that means is if you put every one of those things on a street, you end up with a street that's as wide as I-25. And we know that that's not possible. So the good thing though is we do know, based on community outreach that we've done in the past couple of years, what is important to Denver and Denver citizens or Denver residents for them to be able to see on our streets. And so in previous planning efforts, we heard from thousands of Denverites about what's important, especially from a transportation perspective. So going back to both the comprehensive plan update and the Blueprint Denver plan that was adopted last year and is meant to give guidance over the next 20 years, we heard from, as I mentioned, thousands of Denver residents about what is important from a transportation perspective. And there was a lot of themes that we heard pretty frequently, one of them being safety, some of those also being providing more travel options, so more ways to get around, making transportation more affordable, and having neighborhoods that are better connected. I'm going to touch on a couple of the key themes that we heard. And these aren't just things that we hear or that we heard during the Blueprint or comprehensive planning effort. This is also things that we hear, I want to say, almost in every public meeting that we go to and we're doing outreach in the community. These are things that we hear constantly. So the need to have safer and slower speeds on streets. We always hear you'll often hear someone say that vehicles in my neighborhood, they drive too fast, I'd like to slow them down. We also hear a lot about the need and desire for safer crossings. One of the other big things is adding more space for loading and drop-offs, especially that more people are getting goods delivered directly to their houses. Oftentimes we don't have a legal spot for them to park, and that requires them to park in the middle of the road. So we have heard that we need to find a way to provide them with more space to be able to do so legally. But we also hear a lot about completing sidewalks, again, about more ways to get around, some more travel options, having more street trees. Our trees are tree canopies, super important value to Denverites. And then also not having as many obstructions when you're actually a pedestrian on the sidewalk, not having to go around utility boxes, and having adequate space to simply walk on the street. And then we've also heard a lot about the importance of transit frequency, as I think you guys, as we saw during the RTD presentation, and shared the desire for shared streets, kind of like what we are seeing with some of our temporary shared streets. So it brings me to this Complete Street Design Guidelines. So we've heard about some of the things, and what I just mentioned only scratches the surface, but we've heard a lot in the past about what Denverites value in terms of transportation and in terms of the design on the street. So we want to make sure that we have a document that collects all of that really makes sure that it reflects all of those values, so that when the city engineers or when the designers are making decisions about how streets get designed, it is truly reflective of those values. So that brings me to, what are the complete street design guidelines? And that's exactly what it is. It's meant to be a very large in-depth document that provides recommended design parameters on all kinds of things, whether that be widths of sidewalks, widths of travel lanes, the different types of safety features that you might see on the street. And these are all based on engineering that is based on national best practices. And it also helps us to determine as practitioners, where are the appropriate places for some of these. So for example, if we are thinking about recommending a neighborhood traffic circle, where are the appropriate locations to put those, and what are the speed and volumes that would warrant putting one of those in? So this is really meant to be a very comprehensive guide, and pretty much everything that you can think of about a street is included in this document. And I'll talk a little bit about what is included in that in just a minute. So I probably don't need to say why we need street design guidelines, but I do want to mention that, you can go around on any street in Denver and you quickly can realize that not all streets are the same, but the way that our current standards for Denver are written is they treat all streets as if they are the same. And we realize that we need a more context-sensitive approach to street design. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute, but one example that I'll give is think about Smith Road, which is considered from DOTI's perspective to be an arterial. And then we have a Colfax, which is also considered to be an arterial. They are very different streets with very different needs, but right now, the way that our standards are written, there's no way to say that maybe Colfax should have wider sidewalks because of the number of pedestrians on it. So there really is a need to have more context-sensitive guidelines for streets. And I kind of like to think of the street design guidelines as being zoning for streets that help to address that. And there's also a need to address things that we haven't addressed in the past, like traffic calming, and new things that we're seeing, like parklets or shared spaces, as I mentioned before. So these are the street types that were actually developed through the Blueprint Denver process. So you'll see that there's 6 on here. There's 2 that we added, which were local streets and then contemporary parkways as part of this process. But these, again, are intended to help us be able to make more place-based design decisions. And again, these were developed through that Blueprint Denver process. I do want to pause and mention that this project, or the design guidelines themselves, are actually meant to occur in 2 different phases. So right now we're in phase 1, and this is the guidelines themselves. This is taking every little thing that you can imagine about street design and the different various street elements and combining them all together into one cohesive document. And then there's a second phase that needs to happen to give the guidelines some teeth. So I think of it as, phase 1 says what you should do, and phase 2 will say what you shall do. So it is taking these again and updating our rules, standards, and regulations. But this first phase is important because there's some things like traffic calming or speed reduction tools that we don't have any guidance or policies on at all. So we needed to create those guidelines first before we can come up with the rules, standards, and regulations that will kind of make these more enforceable for us as a city. There was outreach that we did as a part of this. As I mentioned, we've heard through previous planning efforts through Denver Right what the values are and what's important to Denver from a transportation perspective. We did do additional outreach during this process. We held some stakeholder working groups. We also did one-on-one meetings. We had a special working group with both the development and the freight community to talk about how we can better accommodate freight on streets. We also did outreach to council offices, and then we did an online survey that went to the public that was also written in both English, Spanish, and Vietnamese so that we could get a broader group. And it asked questions about what people value in the street, what trade-offs they're willing to make. So a lot of good information there. And then we did presentations to INC. So this is our second presentation to you all, as well as to Planning Board, the Mayor's Bicycle Advisory Committee, and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. Just really quickly, some of the things that we heard, we heard that it's really important that you can't stress enough the tree canopy. Having green infrastructure is really important. And then also the desire to slow down speeds. We heard a lot about more clear definition about what it means when we say a shared street. And so I think that the guidelines where they're at today do a pretty good job of doing that. And then also clear definitions about what it means to be a parkway. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later too. We also heard from community groups an emphasis on accessibility, that right now downtown is considered a pedestrian priority area, but no one knows what that means. So we need greater clarity on that, and not to punish freight. You know, they are providing a service for us, and so we need to provide them with the adequate space to provide their services legally. And then finally, just making sure that the standards match what are the best national practices. So I very quickly just gave you some of the background and why we're doing the complete street design guidelines, but now I'm going to jump into the actual document itself. And so what I'd like to do is give you sort of a layout. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that are included in here, and then I'll get to the highlights. So this document, this is what the cover looks like. It's about 105 pages long, so it's very lengthy, and there's a lot of information in here. It starts off with an introduction that, again, reminds us of what our guiding principles are, and some of the background work that's already been done. And then in addition to it, our second chapter goes more into those individual street types and talks about how does the design of a main street differ from an industrial street. And then finally on the third chapter, it goes into a lot of details about individual street elements. So there is guidance about street lights, there is guidance about utilities, there is guidance about trees. All of those things are included in a lot more detail in that third chapter. And then finally, the fourth chapter is all about implementation and maintenance. So it's basically saying who maintains the street, who implements these guidelines, and kind of deciphers who that responsibility falls on. So the first chapter, just to let you know what's in it, is just that reminder that the importance of street design and the fact that it can save lives, especially as a city is committed to a Vision Zero goal, so a goal of zero traffic deaths, that this important, you're really recognizing the role that street design plays as a part of that. And you'll notice this pyramid at the top. This is reflective of the values that we heard again in Blueprint and during the comprehensive plan, that we need to be prioritizing our most vulnerable users first. And so we acknowledge that that is our commitment, and that we need to be prioritizing, starting with those that are those that are walking and rolling first before we get to everything else. And then the second chapter, as I mentioned, it's going into that street type and design framework. So there's a lot of different details in here. But again, you can see on this one, for example, this is talking about a downtown street, and you'll see that it talks about the preferred minimum and maximum dimensions for each zone. So what is it goes into what are the maximum and minimum widths for sidewalks, for travel lanes, for bike lanes, or transit lanes. And it also helps us to make decisions about priorities. So as I mentioned before, often it's difficult to fit everything that you would like to have on the street. And so we often sometimes find that we have conflicts between what we are prioritizing. So this also gives us a little bit more guidance about what is it that we should be prioritizing depending on the street type. Is it space for trees? Is it space for restaurant seating or cafe seating? Is it space just for the sidewalk widths? Really helping us to make better and more informed decisions about that. So just one example, this is showing a main street. And again, you can see how there's this minimum and preferred dimensions for the frontage zone, which is the area right next to the building, the sidewalk zone, which is the area in between the building and the curb, the amenity zone, which would be where trees are planted, and then the curbside zone, so where you might have parking, or you might have bicycle parking, or even parklets. So you'll see all of the different guidance on there about that. Again, kind of just you can see an example of where how it is showing how those priorities may shift depending on the street type. And then there's also overlays. So if you are on a street that has a transit overlay or a bicycle overlay, how do you design the street differently based on that? So a lot of information in there, and I'm really just going over this quickly just to kind of highlight and give you a little bit of a framework for what's included in here. It is a very technical document, and so there's a lot of information that's included in this. The third chapter goes into all of the different street design elements that I talked about. So you can see there's a page for each one of these. So it's a lot of different elements that are included in this. There is guidance about parklets. We talk about street furniture. We talk about corners. We talk about chicanes and pinch points, no turn on red restrictions. So when can you do those, and when can you use that as a tool? So all of those different elements are included in here, and I'm going to highlight a couple of them in just a minute. Just an example of this, you can see this is our page about corner and curb radii. So this is a very technical term here, but what it's showing is it's based on the street type is what should the radius of a corner of an intersection be. This actually has a direct relationship with safety because if you are able to slow down turning vehicle or turning movements, that can make it safer for pedestrians that are crossing the street. So there's a direct correlation there. And so there are things like this where we're constantly thinking about safety and trying to address the safety needs on the street. And that's why you'll see this adjusted. But when I mentioned, or a minute ago, I mentioned how technical this document is. And so this is really just kind of an example of how much detail is included in here about all these things. And again, that's based on engineering best practices, both that we've found in Denver, but also based on our NACDO partner cities and around the country. Another one that I wanted to mention is there's guidance about the pedestrian, the pedestrian rail. So depending on what street or the type of street you're on, you'll notice that those dimensions change. So on a downtown street, we are definitely preferring wider sidewalks, where on certain industrial streets, the preferred width might not be as much. So it's really trying to better accommodate those uses on streets where it's expected that we're going to have a lot of pedestrians, trying to make sure that that is included in here from a design perspective. So next, I'm going to highlight a couple of features that I would say that I'm personally most excited about, but I think that I know you as a group will probably be excited about as well. So I already talked about this one a lot, but I'm really excited about having context-sensitive street design. You'll notice on this page that what the kind of typical layout of an industrial street looks different from a main street. And again, just as a city, I think we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to street design. So it's really important that we are also looking at that place as well. Another aspect that I'm excited about is contemporary parkways. So Game Plan Denver, that is sort of the master plan for the Parks Department. They updated their game plan during the Denver process as well. And one of the things that came up a lot is a need to extend the parkways that we have. So there's these great legacy parkways that we have, but they're not in every part of the city. A lot of them were never fully utilized or fully developed. And so how can we provide those, but in today's context? So there is a whole section that is written on what a contemporary parkway should look like. There's a lot more work that needs to happen to really make these come to fruition, but this is kind of providing a general framework. And then also green infrastructure, just again, some specific details about green infrastructure and its importance for Denver, especially as we think about climate mitigation and being environmentally resilient. And then the last two, one of them is traffic calming. So we in Denver have never had specific guidance on these traffic calming features and on when we can use them. So there's a lot of different tools that we can have to be able to slow down vehicles or slow down traffic. I mentioned before that a lot of times we'll hear from community feedback that speeding is one of the top concerns that we get. But now we have guidance from the street design guidelines that will say what features are appropriate to use when, and what locations are these appropriate, and what warrants us using one feature versus the other. So I'm really excited about that. This took a lot of work to get everybody on board. We did meet with, this was a process that involved RTD, it involved parks, it also involved the fire department. I believe that we went out with the fire department to actually test one of these treatments to make sure that they were on board. But again, this has been something that we all collectively agreed on was an important part to include as a part of these design guidelines. So just one quick example, you'll see here this, again, very technical, but providing this particular example is when is it appropriate to use chicanes, which is a fancy way of narrowing the roadway to discourage speeding. So again, this is showing when can we use those, and if we do design them, what do they have to look like? We also have, and I know this is something that's been brought up from this group before, but when is it appropriate to have no turn on red restrictions? And so again, just some general guidance there. And again, these are things that we did not have before. And then one of them the last one that I wanted to highlight is design speed. So that's something that as a city we recognize is definitely critically important. And there's a quote on here that I want to highlight, which is that a street is only as safe as its fastest traveling motor vehicle. One of the ways that cities and streets used to be designed is that you would have your posted speed limit, say it was 35 miles an hour, but the actual design speed would oftentimes be higher and much higher than that. And so what this is doing is correcting for that and realizing that we need to flip that. If we want vehicles to go slower, we need to design our streets in a way that discourages them from speeding. A street that is 4 lanes wide with no trees and has very wide lanes is going to encourage speeding, whereas streets that are narrower, have trees, have some of the features that I mentioned, tend to, based on studies, slow down traffic and discourage that speeding. And so this is really recognizing the importance that design itself plays on speed, and in addition to the speed limit as well. So we are open. This document is open. I would recommend getting there by simply just typing in Denver Complete Street Design or Denver Street Design Guidelines. That's how I look for it. But this is available online. You can click here to get the link for the document itself. And then if you want to provide comments, you can click here using this form. I will say that this is an extremely technical document. This is meant to be something that a practitioner, so like an engineer or a planner or an architect, could use. And so we are taking public input on the document, but do keep in mind, there's going to be certain things that, like the lane widths or how wide what the radius of a corner should be, that might be a little bit strange for the public to view. But we are still taking public comments on the contents of the document. So,
thank you. And these links did go out with a meeting announcement, and they'll go out with the meeting notes as well. But please go back to the meeting announcement to get the link right to this page where you can download the guidelines. So it's a single PDF of about 100 pages, and the beautiful graphics that were used here are from that document, and then a form for comments. Now we are out of time, but we're going to go over every speaker, I think, except for Jill, just went a little bit over. Understand if some people have to drop off. We'll just go about 10 minutes for questions. So I got literally 7 questions, all on the same topic, and I'm going to ask Amy Kenrick and apologies if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, to ask a version of it.
Sure, Ken Rye, like rye bread.
Ken Rye.
My question is, I feel like oftentimes the fire department is a roadblock, no pun intended, to DOTI, and keeps them from installing like life-saving traffic calming features because their trucks are so large. So is that true? And also, what can we do as community members or as members of Inc. To change that?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, I'm happy to say that the fire department was definitely brought along during this entire process. So they were not only a part of the project team, but a part of the core team. So in every single meeting that we had about the design guidelines, the fire department was a part of those. There was definitely a little bit of hesitancy at times, but everything that ultimately made it into the guidelines is we were able to put in here because there was agreement between both DOTI and the fire department. So that was, I would say, was the first part of the question. And then, like I mentioned before, we also did go out, I believe, and tested some of these things, where we've indicated that we are willing to test these things with the fire department. I know that there was hesitancy about speed lumps, they're different than speed bumps, but we ended up kind of coming to a compromise where we are designing them in a way that the fire trucks can still drive through them without damaging their vehicles, but it would still provide it would still slow down their normal standard vehicle. So there was definitely a little bit of give and take. But I think especially, just from what INC can do is continuing to express support for traffic calming and for the kinds of things that we're hearing, because that was something that we definitely use a lot is, look, this is a Denver value. This is something that people are really wanting. We also use our data to show about how many accidents are happening from speeds. So it's definitely a critical part.
Great, and this may be one, I mean, given the number of comments, this is really remarkable in the chat here, people who are having variations on this. I would certainly suggest people individually or as RNOs use the feedback link to talk about this topic or variations of it. We are, the city is searching for a new fire chief, and someone in the chat suggested maybe that's a point of getting involved in saying we need a fire chief who supports right-sized equipment. Next, I want to call on David Mincer. And David, I'm going to find you to unmute. And you had a question about kind of how these get implemented over time.
Yes, thank you. There's been a lot of construction in our neighborhood, basic routine maintenance and doing a lot of curb and gutter reconstruction on 13th and 14th Aves and 11th Ave. And these are all streets, as far as I could tell, it would be appropriate to put bulb outs at the intersection, but it hasn't been done. So my question is, with these guidelines, would this be something that would be standard with routine maintenance, or would each project have to be kind of considered for these treatments?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's actually 3 ways that we'll be implementing these over time. One is through redevelopment. So at any time that development happens, they're required to, as a condition for that development, to make improvements to the right-of-way. So for example, if our recommendations or our guidelines do require bulb outs at intersections, or if they are requiring wider sidewalks, then the developer would be held to that. Second is, and this doesn't happen very often, but if we were to rebuild an entire street, so like when we rebuilt Brighton, we would use these guidelines. But the third, I would say, is any time that we're making a general transportation improvement. So for example, oftentimes we're going out and doing intersection-based safety improvements, or we're going out and building a bike lane or a dedicated transit lane, or we are rebuilding a signal, then we would be held to these same guidelines as well. So it's kind of implemented over time and through 3 different mechanisms. And we are, even though the next step, as I mentioned, we still have to complete the standards, we are still able to somewhat regulate off of these. And we are even, I think, as a department, starting to use these a little bit. So in some ways, we are already consulting them, even though the process isn't completely done, and even though they haven't been formalized into the standards.
Can I just ask specifically when, in like, for example, the bond has a lot of curb and gutter work, milling, paving, just really routine stuff. And curb and gutter, especially, they are reconstructing the curb, but they're not putting bulb outs in. Will that be kind of like an ADA ramp? It'll just be done as part of the process whenever they do curb and gutter reconstruction.
It likely would be part of the reconstruction. However, I think there's also, thankfully, because of this, we'll have guidance about when it makes sense to do a bulb out or when it doesn't. And so there will be that too. Some of that actually comes from the neighborhood plans, like the MPI process. And so then this is saying, okay, when we do build a bulb out, then what are the dimensions? What does it look like? That kind of thing.
Thank you.
Actually getting a lot of kind of related questions, Riley, about when this will be used, and then also what the typology is on what street and what input the community has on that, how that might evolve over time. But Amanda Roberts just asked a good version of it, a version of this kind of question. Amanda, are you, I'm going to ask if you want to ask what you have here.
I'm here. Yeah, I just have a question. First of all, I love these complete street guidelines, so thank you, DOTI. I read them, nerded out Friday night on them, but I do have a specific question for existing DOTI projects. So community bikeways, Lincoln Transit, all of the things that are in the dashboard right now for DOTI, are these complete street guidelines going to be applied to those projects that are in process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So and I can't speak to every project just because there's too many of them for me to keep track of, but I will say I know that we have already been starting to look at the guidelines for certain projects. So a lot of times, just as I mentioned, we're already consulting this document, and especially I know for like the transit and for the bike piece of it, there's actually a whole separate document that's supposed to come out just about bicycles and all the individual design elements with those. So there's a separate document that has been released. I don't know if it's on our website or not yet. I think it's actually being finalized. That is being used already for, all of the bikeway projects that we have ongoing. I'm not sure about the transit piece of it, but I will say this is definitely something that there is appetite to use. And so I imagine that when this wraps up, that it will still impact those projects that we've already started and or at least doing the concept planning for, that we would want to consult this.
Riley, so process-wise, the guidelines, once those are finalized, that doesn't mean that they're the law, the engineering guidelines yet. There's a whole nother step, which is translating the guidelines, which exist in this kind of beautiful package, down into engineering standards, and only then are they like held accountable for using the new standards. Do I understand that correctly?
Correct. It's I'm not super clear on how this works. My understanding is that when this plan is complete, we can still we can still require development to use it. I think there's still a little bit of leeway though, and I think that's what the standards are for, is to really tie them up. These are also meant to be flexible, and some of them have ranges associated with them, and I imagine that when we do the standards, rules, and regulations, that's going to tighten these up a little bit further. So for example, if we have in our guideline informs what a lot of the minimum widths are for these things, and if you were a developer or if you were designing a street and you couldn't meet that minimum, you would have to request a variance for it, and then that would get reviewed. And so that's kind of where it's helping to give a little bit more teeth.
Okay. As always, the city has limited funds, so it's easy to talk about how something applies to something new. It's harder to understand when something kind of terribly designed might get redesigned in light of these. And I think there are a lot of questions that kind of fall into that category. We had two people, I'm just going to wrap up by summarizing several questions. Two people asked about the speed humps in the context of snow plowing. Of course, other surrounding communities have some version of speed humps and get approximately as much snow as we do. How did you get there?
Great question. So we involved our maintenance team as a part of this too. So this has been, all this stuff has been vetted not only through our city traffic engineer, but also through operations. And I think that we found design solutions that would work and not mess up the plow equipment. One of the things too to mention is that where you're going to see these speed lumps is likely not going to be on a major arterial street like Colfax. They're meant more as a traffic calming on a residential street. And on residential streets, we don't use the same type of plows that we use to clear the major streets. Typically, it's the smaller like Ford trucks that you're using, the kind of pickup trucks, and those have the ability to. That's less hard on those. I think they have the ability to lift up their plows in a different way that is not harmful to them. And so that's, I think, part of the reason why we were able to get those there.
Great. And then two people, and I'm scrolling up and down to find the names, just said they love it. Nicole mentioned that they love that she loved aspects of this, and there was somebody else who said it. So some positive feedback. Hopefully that turns into comments. We're essentially out of time here. I just want to end with, as people review these guidelines, again, there is no map in these guidelines. Where does that map exist? I think it's in Blueprint Denver. And so can people kind of look at the street typology recommendations in Blueprint and then translate in their minds which of these sets of priorities that this document represents are envisioned for their street?
For sure. So the map of the individual street types, so whether something's an industrial or a main street, that actually was done through community input in Blueprint Denver. And that was informed largely by all of the neighborhood plans, all the other plans that have already been adopted, but those can change in the future. So for example, I think there's parts of Colorado that were labeled in Blueprint Denver, Colorado Boulevard, that are labeled as a main street, and why they certainly don't function or look that way today. They're meant to be aspirational, and that's because the neighborhood plans for that area are such that they are recommending that in the future. And so a lot of this was based off of what those plans were. We'll also say that streets can change depending on where they're at in the city. So not all of Federal has one street type. There's parts of Federal that are considered residential, parts of it that are considered mixed use, and just depending on whatever the current and future land use is. So comments on kind of changing those, I think, would have to be handled through an amendment to Blueprint, but that Blueprint is meant to be a living document. So in terms of the other things like the transit streets and the bicycle streets, that happens both through our Denver Moves Bicycles plan, which determines what streets have bike infrastructure. And then the transit plan, the Denver Moves Transit, that came out 2 years ago, that indicates what streets are proposed to have transit infrastructure on them in the future. And so those are the planning documents that are feeding into those typologies for this.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's a big milestone. INC is going to do what we did for Denver Moves Transit, Denver Moves Peds and Trails, is we're going to make our own feedback on this based solely on what's already in our platform. So there's a lot of other good ideas in here that our platform didn't speak to, but for the things we called for, we're going to give you a document, probably a couple pages of what we think were the hits and what we think were the misses. So do look forward to that, as well as all the individual comments and R&O comments that hopefully this introduction helped help people realize it's here, and their comments are welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone joining us tonight. We will be sending out to the same mailing list the notes and links to the presentations and then the upload of the video. Thank you all, and if you would write to transportation@denverinc.org with any ideas for what you like about this format, what you don't like about this format, we're